I made a game about an evil raven summoning imps to end the world. It's a simple game with some similarities to Pikmin, but developing this game was anything but simple. I learned and discovered some really cool things, most of which didn't even make it into the final product. I started making this game for the Ludum Dare 55 Game Jam, which, for those who don't know, gives you 72 hours to create a video game from scratch based on a theme. The theme this time was summoning. I tried to weasel my way out of the most obvious interpretation, because all the ideas that came to mind involved controlling a bunch of NPCs, which probably meant that I'd need to learn how to do pathfinding and some kind of AI, and that felt a little intimidating. But a short YouTube video explaining how easy it is to use Godot's built-in pathfinding quickly quelled most of my concerns, and pretty soon I had an idea that I thought was interesting. You, the player, have created a portal. Using the portal, you summon imps to destroy the world, but the local villagers have found out and are trying to stop you by destroying the portal. So, you need to simultaneously protect the portal from the villagers, while also collecting enough life force from them to power up the portal and end the world. New project. Add pathfinding. Navigation region with a mesh beneath it, and a navigation agent with a physics body above it. Easy peasy. The nav agent does all the calculations to actually create the path, so all I have to do is tell it how to follow said path. Added a player with some basic movement, and set it as the target position so I could start experimenting with the pathfinding and build an AI for the imps. My first goal with the AI was to prevent the imp from following the player once they're out of sight. Simple enough. Just use a raycast to check if anything's blocking the imp's line of sight, and stop pursuing the player if so. But then when the player went around the corner, the imps would immediately stop and give up. So I added a short timer that begins counting down once the player is out of sight. While the timer is still going, the imp knows where the player is and continues pursuing them. Better, but I also noticed that in large groups, the imps that were in the back often couldn't see the player for long periods of time, leading to them giving up while the rest of the group trails away. So I created a buddy system. I gave each imp a little radius around them for detecting other imps. Once the player is out of sight and the countdown has started, they check if any nearby imps can still see the player. If so, the countdown is reset. But if none of them can see the player, then they search for the imp that has the most time left, meaning that they were the last to see the player. From there, they all synchronize their timers to that value. And if nobody can see the player and all of the timers have run out, they will then seek out the last place they remember the player being and wait there. That way, if an imp saw the player through a window for example, it could take whatever path was needed to get there and not give up halfway because the player was out of sight. And with that, I had a simple but convincing enough AI. Next, I wanted these imps to have various tasks that they could be assigned to. I wanted to click on an imp, give it some instruction, and have it carry out said instruction. Better yet, I wanted a way to select a large group of imps to command simultaneously. Pikmin has a big circle select thing, but I wanted something more akin to the lasso tool in Photoshop, essentially allowing me to draw a fence around everything I wanted to select. So how do you create a lasso tool in 3D? Well, I had no idea. And as I'm writing this, it has just occurred to me that I probably could have Googled it. Well, in any case, here's what I did try. My first step was to create a collection of 3D positions every time I drew a shape. Send a raycast from the mouse position onto the floor in 3D space, which for some reason was surprisingly difficult. Then, add that point to an array. Once the mouse had moved far enough away from the previous point, a new point would be created and added to the array. This array would be reset anytime I started a new selection. From there, I figured I could use these points to construct a collision mesh. But I had never procedurally generated a mesh before, and I found looking that up quite interesting. I learned that there is a lot of data in a 3D mesh. Or there can be. I really only had to worry about 2 of these, since I just needed enough visual information to confirm that the mesh being made looked how I intended. Another fun fact about generating a mesh is that the total number of points or vertices needs to be divisible by 3. Kind of. There's a way around this where you specify which points are being reused, but to keep it simple, 3. 3 points make up a triangle, and every mesh is made out of triangles, because triangles are the simplest polygon and computers like that. Now I had to figure out how to connect all of these points such that the shape is completely filled with triangles. And this was the simplest solution I could think of. First, find the sum vector of every point in the scene. Second, divide the magnitude by the total number of points to get the average position of all points. Third, for every 2 subsequent points on the list, connect them to that average position to make a triangle. I had to work this out very meticulously, which required me to debug a bunch of arrays and for loops. But soon enough... Oh, okay, it almost kind of works. From there, I made some small adjustments, like offsetting the points from the floor to reduce said fighting, and attaching material with culling disabled so I could view the mesh from both sides. And then, it was working! From there, using the points to generate collisions was a cinch. Just like that, I was able to select, and in the short term destroy, a whole army of imps with just a quick little doodle. But it wasn't perfect. Drawing simple shapes with no overlapping points looked fine, but the minute I tried to draw anything with a lip or overlap, it all fell apart. And this took me on quite the journey of figuring out what to do. I pursued one idea where each point would calculate some normal vector based on the angle between surrounding points and compare it to the center of the mesh to generate new center points, which led me to research how to get the proper center of a mesh and not just the average of all points. And all of this culminated in me sitting in front of a video explaining how to calculate the centroid of a mesh with symbols on screen that I didn't understand, wondering if the information was relevant to my cause and if my cause would even work, until at some point I snapped out of my flow and just went, I shouldn't be doing this. It was nearly 9 o'clock, there was 1 day left in my 3-day game jam, and here I was spending my time trying to make a lasso feature while the rest of the game didn't even, well, exist. So, begrudgingly, I moved on. I went back to working on the imp AI, adding different states that correspond to different jobs, and making a little menu for selecting said jobs. But when I woke up the next morning, I realized 2 things. 1, I'm trying to make a cool game, and 2, I don't have time to make a cool game. I need a finished result, so I cut back on my ideas until I was left with the bare essentials. Player that moves, portal that summons imps, imps that attack enemies, and enemies that attack the portal. But, as a consequence of that simplification, I had to reduce my code. I got rid of the idea for imps to have different tasks since I wouldn't have time to design the tasks, nor the AI to carry them out. Now, all that the imps would do is track down the mouse and fight any nearby enemies. Since the imps could no longer carry out different tasks, there was no need to select the imps. So I got rid of the lasso tool, and since I wouldn't have the imps doing different tasks in different places, I didn't need to design a detailed arena. And since I wasn't designing a detailed arena and all the imps were just gonna follow the mouse, I didn't need the imps to check that they could see where they were going. After tearing all the extraneous limbs off my game, I was left with about a half hour's worth of usable code and 10 hours left to make it into a game. Awesome. Lovely. I created a system for combat, a node with values for health, damage, and methods for attacking, taking damage, and dying. The imps have this node, the portal has this node, and the enemies, whose only job is to spawn near the edge of the map and charge straight for the portal, have this node. The combat system has a Boolean value that lets entities know when they are near enemies of theirs so that they can stop whatever they're doing and fight to the death. When an enemy dies, the player is given life force, which the portal keeps track of. And when the player has saved enough, they can spend that life force at the portal to either summon more imps, or if they've saved up a lot, they can end the world and win the game. A good chunk of those last hours were spent making 3D models. I made 2, one for the player and one for the imp, and they each took about 2 hours to make. Early into the jam, I had drawn some concept art for the player. A raven in a dress vest with a fluffy tippet and a wizard hat. My biggest struggle when creating this model was remembering that I was making a raven and not a crow, and naming and researching accordingly. And my second biggest struggle was the wings. I wanted them to be folded up when wandering around, but also able to flap if needed. Rigging was hell. But I did end up with something usable. I did not have any concept art for the imp though, just an assortment of references and the requirement that it be low poly and take up a generally spherical space. It took a few failed attempts before I found myself heading in a direction that I was happy with. I carefully extruded limbs, adjusted proportions, and with the help of a ball scaled to the size of the imp's collider, squashed everything into position. By the time I had the models colored, animated, and working in-game, I was left with less than an hour to submit. I spent that time tightening up the gameplay loop, balancing the values, and throwing down some quick textures so the game wouldn't look totally unfinished, though there was a slight disparity in quality between the Raven and Imp models and, everything else. I made a build, uploaded it, added some branding, realized I'd made a crucial mistake in the build, amended it, and I was done. I had finished the game. Well, at least as far as the jam was concerned. The game could be played, it could be lost, and it could be beat. It was everything I could have hoped for in one net day of development. But between then and now, I've made some changes. I created a new feather-inspired portal model with a fun swirling shader. I made a proper model and animations for the enemies. I made a main menu, a settings menu, and a pause menu. I made the environment a little nicer with a couple lakes, trees, and hills. I added sound effects, particle effects, and my own original piece of music. It's simple, just some drums, bass, and a few random melodies throughout. I've been learning how to use FL Studio so that I can make my own music for games, and to encourage me, I've disallowed myself from using royalty-free music in my games going forward, so that I'm either forced to make my own or leave the game in complete silence. And just in case you do play the game and decide that complete silence is preferable to what I've made, I've added a slider in the settings menu specifically for the music. And with that, the game is done. Part of me really wanted to pursue some of those original mechanics after the jam had ended, but doing so would take a lot of time, especially if I wanted to make the mechanics fun and worthwhile. But I don't want to put too much time into one project at the moment. I'm currently in a phase of rapid experimentation and learning and want to continue with this for a little bit. Maybe down the road I'll come back to this idea and expand on it further, but I'm good with this for the time being. I have some other interesting ideas that I want to pursue, so I'm going to take what I've learned and move forward. As is, I like the game that I made, and if you would like to play it, there's a link below the video. Ciao for now.